You're not tired because you live too much. You're tired because you care too much. You care about judgment, about the past, about the future, and about things you cannot control. And without even realizing it, you give your peace away to small things, empty people, and problems that do not even exist yet. But the great philosophers already understood something that few people are able to practice. True freedom begins when you stop carrying what was never supposed to weigh so much. Not caring is not coldness. It is wisdom. Epictetus starts with an idea that is almost shocking in its simplicity. Most human suffering does not come from what happens, but from confusing what is in our hands with what never was. In the manual, also known as the Enchiridion, he opens Stoic thought with a decisive division. Some things depend on us, and others do not. What depends on us is our judgment, our choices, our intentions, and the way we interpret events. What does not depend on us is other people's opinions, recognition, the past, most outcomes, and almost everything the world does without asking our permission. For Epictetus, peace begins exactly there. When a person stops demanding control over what cannot be controlled, this is not a philosophy of passivity. It is a philosophy of inner economy. Epictetus is not telling you to give up on life, or to become cold, indifferent, or emotionally numb. The point is more subtle. Not everything deserves your emotional energy. Some battles cost more than they are worth. Some arguments do not bring clarity. They only feed the ego. Some people do not want to understand. They only want to win. And there are losses, delays, criticisms, and frustrations that become huge not because of their real weight, but because our mind insists on treating them as if they define our worth. That is strategic indifference, not caring about everything in the same way. Instead of reacting to every provocation, every comparison, every setback along the way, a person learns to ask, does this depend on me? If the answer is no, then suffering too much over it means handing your peace over to chance. If the answer is yes, then your focus should go toward possible action, not complaint. This small shift changes your whole life. Because when you stop wasting energy trying to control what is uncontrollable, you have more strength left to govern the only territory you can truly shape, yourself. It is impressive how current this teaching still feels. Just think about how many people live today, trapped by unanswered messages, by numbers on social media, by instant approval, by other people's opinions, by invisible expectations. One rude comment can ruin the whole day. One moment of rejection becomes proof of inadequacy. A plan that did not work out turns into an identity crisis. Epictetus would walk into this scene with relentless clarity and ask, since when has your peace depended so much on the instability of the world? The problem is not feeling. The problem is making what lies outside your control the center of your inner life. In imperial Rome, where Epictetus taught, the world was also harsh, uncertain, and deeply unequal. He himself lived as a slave before becoming a philosophical teacher. That is why his thought did not come from the comfort of abstraction. It came from the real experience of someone who understood, perhaps in a brutal way, that inner freedom is not having power over events, but refusing to let them decide who you will be. That gives his teaching a rare strength. It does not promise to remove pain, but to stop pain from ruling the soul. In practice, this lesson requires mental discipline. When someone criticizes you unfairly, for example, the natural impulse is to react, defend yourself, prove your point, convince them. But Epictetus would invite you into an inner pause. The criticism belongs to the other person. What belongs to you is what you do with it. You can examine it honestly, correct what is true, and throw away what is only poison. The same is true with failure. Not every effort brings results. Not every merit is applauded. Not every act of loyalty is returned. And that is exactly why maturity means no longer measuring your life only by outside rewards. There is also something deeply freeing in this view. It breaks emotional dependence on validation. Anyone who lives trying to control impressions becomes a slave to other people's eyes. But the person who learns to care for their own character, conscience, and choices finds a stronger kind of dignity. Epictetus teaches that a person's worth is not found in seeming admirable, but in acting with integrity, even when no one applauds. That is especially powerful in a time obsessed with visibility. Not every form of exposure is an achievement. Not every bit of attention is respect. Not every round of applause is truth. The faster, more competitive, and more performative the world becomes, the more essential it is to know where to place your energy. Anyone who does not learn this distinction will be consumed by anxiety, overstimulation, and a constant feeling of not being enough. But the one who truly absorbs this lesson begins to experience a rare kind of strength, the calm of not reacting to everything, the wisdom of not fighting every war, and the maturity of not turning every discomfort into drama. At its core, the philosophy of Epictetus is a severe but deeply compassionate invitation. Stop giving your peace away to what you cannot control. Not everything deserves your worry, your rush, your anger, or your need to fix it. There is a quiet dignity in carefully choosing what truly matters. And that may be one of the highest forms of freedom. Realizing that the world can remain uncertain, people can remain unpredictable, results can remain imperfect, and even so, you can remain whole. Lao Tzu presents one of the hardest ideas for the modern mind to accept. Sometimes the best path is not to push harder, insist more, or control more. In the Tao Te Ching, he suggests exactly the opposite of what the competitive world usually teaches. There are moments when too much force creates disorder, too much interference gets in the way, and the attempt to dominate everything breaks the harmony that was already beginning to form. That is where the principle of Wu Wei comes in, often translated as non-action, although that phrase can be misleading. Lao Tzu is not defending laziness, neglect, or escape. He is speaking of action without rigidity, without inner violence, and without the compulsive need to control the flow of life. This wisdom comes from observing nature. Water is one of the great images in Taoism. It does not shout, compete, or harden itself out of pride, yet it moves through mountains, flows around stones, and over time changes entire landscapes. Its strength lies precisely in not forcing. While what is hard breaks, what is flexible remains. While the anxious person tries to pull results out by force, the wise person understands the right timing of things. This is a deeply unsettling lesson because it challenges the human impulse to believe that everything improves when we increase the pressure. Lao Tzu's answer is this: many times, that pressure is exactly what ruins things. In everyday life, this shows up clearly. There are people who try to control every conversation, every response, every stage of life, and every reaction from others. They want to predict everything, secure everything, and prevent any detour. But the more they try to hold the world in their hands, the more anxiety they create. Relationships start to suffocate. Projects lose their natural flow. The body gets sick. The mind becomes exhausted. And then the most dangerous illusion appears: the idea that the problem is not controlling enough. Lao Tzu turns that logic upside down. Many times, the problem is exactly too much control. When life is treated like something that must obey our will all the time, peace disappears. Wu Wei offers another kind of intelligence, acting in harmony with reality, not at war with it. That means sensing the moment to move forward and the moment to step back, the time to speak and the time to stay quiet, the point where persistence is courage and the point where persistence has become attachment. It is a philosophy of precision, not passivity. The skilled archer does not win through desperate tension, but through a balanced gesture. The wise leader does not need to crush everyone around him in order to lead, because he understands that real order does not come from constant force. In this view, the mature human being is not the one who tries to bend everything to personal desire, but the one who has learned to cooperate with the deeper movement of things. Historically, this view carries extraordinary weight. In times marked by wars, centralized power, and political ambition, Taoism appears as a quiet critique of the human obsession with controlling everything. Lao Tzu understood something that still feels true today. The more aggressively we try to organize life through sheer force, the more imbalance we create. This applies to governments, families, businesses, and even to our inner life. The person who tries to control even what they feel ends up becoming a stranger to themselves. Instead of listening to the experience, they censor it. Instead of moving with the process, they violate it. Instead of maturing, they become hardened. This teaching becomes even more powerful when we think about the present. We live surrounded by a culture of constant optimization. Everything must be maximized: performance, image, productivity, influence, results. Rest feels like guilt. Waiting feels like weakness. Not knowing feels like failure. In that setting, Lao Tzu sounds almost subversive. He reminds us that life is not a machine built for endless output. Some things grow in the pause, in silence, in patience, and in the space we choose not to invade. A friendship does not bloom under surveillance. Grief does not end on command. An important decision does not become clear in the middle of panic. Some truths only appear when we stop trying to force them to appear. This does not mean giving up responsibility. The point is not to fold your arms and wait for miracles. The point is to act without that inner tension that turns everything into desperation. Think of someone trying to force themselves to sleep. The more they demand sleep, the more awake they become. Think of someone trying to be loved through control. The more they hold on, the more they push the other away. Think of someone looking for clarity about their life and trying to solve everything in one anxious night. The more they force an answer, the more confused they become. There are processes that require presence and discipline, but not brutality. Wu Wei is this rare art of doing what is necessary without distorting the process through anxiety. In the future, this lesson may become even more important. The faster the world moves, the more people will feel tempted to manage life like a total system of control. But human beings do not work that way. Emotions, relationships, inner time, creativity, and wisdom do not follow the same rhythm as machines. The obsession with control promises safety, but often produces only fatigue, fear, and a constant sense of failure. Lao Tzu offers a calmer and perhaps deeper alternative. Instead of trying to dominate everything, learn to align yourself. Instead of forcing the flow, listen to it. Instead of becoming rigid, become flexible. The power of not forcing anything is not weakness. It is trust. Trust that not everything needs to be pushed. Trust that life has rhythms that do not reveal themselves to those who live at war with time. Trust that true strength is not found in squeezing the world until it obeys, but in developing an inner clarity strong enough to know when to act, how to act, and above all, when to stop interfering. Lao Tzu teaches that many times. It is exactly when we stop trying to control everything so much that things finally begin to find their course. Marcus Aurelius understood a truth that still feels painfully relevant today. Whoever reacts to everything ends up belonging to everything. In Meditations, he returns again and again to the need to protect the mind from the tyranny of outside impressions. Not because the world stops hurting, provoking, or disappointing us, but because true freedom does not mean stopping others from speaking, judging, or attacking. It means refusing to hand them control over your inner life. In that sense, stopping caring so much about other people's opinions is not arrogance. It is sovereignty. This point is crucial because many people confuse sensitivity with emotional dependence. To be sensitive is to notice the world. To depend on approval is to let the world decide your worth. Marcus Aurelius draws a firm line between these two things. What other people say can exist. What they think can spread. Their judgment may even be unfair, cruel, or shallow. But none of that has to become law inside you. The philosopher-emperor knew that the human mind suffers less because of events themselves, and because of the permission it gives certain voices to settle at the center of consciousness. In meditations, there is a constant effort to return to oneself, not to an inflated ego, but to inner reason, to the part of the soul that can observe without being immediately dragged away by every stimulus. This matters deeply today, when almost everything around us seems designed to provoke instant reaction. A comment, a criticism, a provocation, a comparison, a sarcastic remark, and right away comes the urge to respond, justify, explain, fix the image, regain control. Marcus Aurelius offers another posture. Not every opinion deserves an answer. Not every attack deserves a fight, and not every interpretation deserves space in your peace. This attitude does not come from weakness, but from disciplined strength. Reacting is easy. Being pulled around by impulse is easy. What is hard is remaining master of yourself when the environment tries to hijack your attention and stability. That is why learning not to care so much about other people's opinions is a daily practice, not an automatic achievement. It means asking, whenever you face judgment, does this affect my character, or does it only touch my pride? Does this reveal a real flaw I need to correct, or does it only wake up my need to be accepted? That distinction is freeing, because as a person matures, they begin to see that not every moral pain comes from a real injustice. Often, it comes from wounded vanity. Marcus Aurelius held one of the most exposed positions in the ancient world. As Emperor of Rome, he was watched, criticized, pressured, and surrounded by expectations. His philosophy, then, was not built far away from noise, but right in the middle of it. That gives his reflections a unique authority. He does not write like someone who escaped responsibility, but like someone who had to remain whole in the middle of power, war, intrigue, and human weakness. Instead of trying to control other people's mouths, he focuses on ruling his own reaction. That is the heart of his inner sovereignty. There is also a moral clarity in this attitude. A person who lives based on other people's opinions almost never acts from conviction. They act from calculation. They say what will be accepted. They show what will be applauded. They hide what might displease others. They adjust their identity to fit the taste of the environment. Little by little, they stop living from the inside out and begin existing from the outside in. Marcus Aurelius saw the danger in this. The soul weakens when it trades integrity for approval. It is better to be just without applause than admired without truth. It is better to preserve your character than manage your image, because image belongs to other people's eyes. Character belongs to your conscience. This teaching helps us understand not only personal life, but also historical and modern-day patterns. Many leaders failed not because they lacked intelligence, but because they could not handle rejection. They needed to please, control the narrative, and dominate perception. And in that obsession, they lost clarity. Today, the same thing happens on an everyday level. People shape emotional, professional, and even spiritual decisions according to the reaction they expect from an audience. The fear of disappointing others becomes paralyzing. The fear of being misunderstood distorts authenticity. The fear of judgment causes entire lives to be spent performing. Marcus Aurelius, with calm severity, would remind us, the crowd changes its mood quickly, and anyone who anchors themselves in it lives in permanent instability. But not caring too much about other people's opinions does not mean ignoring all criticism. That would just be another kind of immaturity. Marcus Aurelius's point is more balanced. Useful criticism should be received with humility. Empty criticism should be met with distance. What matters is not allowing both to take up the same place in your mind. Praise should not intoxicate you. An insult should not destroy you. When a person learns this, something inside becomes more solid. They remain open to growth, but stop being a prisoner of outside judgment. They stay human, but become less vulnerable to emotional manipulation. The more public and digital life expands exposure, the rarer it will become to find someone who does not turn every outside reaction into a measure of their own being. Collective anxiety will keep growing wherever identity depends on constant approval. That is why Marcus Aurelius remains so relevant. He teaches that freedom begins when the mind stops chasing every voice that calls for its attention. There is deep peace in understanding that others may misunderstand you, judge you badly, or reduce you unfairly, and still you can remain aligned with what you know to be true and just. The inner sovereignty Marcus Aurelius speaks of is the art of not abandoning yourself in order to be accepted. It is the quiet courage to remain whole in the middle of noise. Because the moment you no longer feel the need to react to everything, prove everything, or correct every opinion, something changes deeply. The world remains loud, but it no longer commands your soul. Buddha begins with a diagnosis that is as simple as it is profound. Human suffering does not come only from the unavoidable pain of life, but from the way we cling to things, to people, to the images we create, and to the expectations we keep trying to force onto reality. In the central teachings of Buddhism, this truth appears clearly in the Four Noble Truths. The first recognizes that suffering exists. The second shows the source of that suffering: attachment, craving, compulsive desire, the attempt to hold on to what is unstable. The third says that this suffering can come to an end. And the fourth presents a path of transformation. The key point here is this: we suffer not only because we lose things, but because we demand that what changes should not change, that what passes should remain, and that the world should adjust itself to our desires. In the Dhammapada, this view takes on an almost sharp clarity. The undisciplined mind appears as the great source of unrest, because it is always chasing pleasure, rejecting discomfort, and creating fantasies about how life should be. Instead of seeing things as they are, the attached mind covers them with demands. It wants guarantees from what is temporary, permanence from what is impermanent, and control over what will always escape. And when reality does not obey, frustration is born. It is no accident that so much suffering comes with invisible phrases like, "This should not have happened. That person should not have changed. My life should be somewhere else," or "I should not be feeling this." Suffering grows stronger in that very friction between the flow of life and our inner resistance to it. In Buddhism, detachment does not mean cold indifference or the absence of love. That is a common misunderstanding. Buddha does not teach people to become stone. He teaches us to love without possession, to live without the illusion of control, and to move through experience without building a prison out of it. When attached, the human being turns everything into an extension of the self, wanting another person to confirm their identity, wanting success to guarantee their worth, wanting pleasure to last forever, wanting pain to disappear immediately. When detached, a person still feels, cares, acts, and relates to others, but without demanding that the world constantly satisfy their inner lack. That difference changes everything. Love stops being control. Effort stops being desperation. Loss stops feeling like total destruction. This wisdom becomes especially clear when we look at how people suffer psychologically because of expectation. It is not only what happened that hurts, but the mental image that was shattered. A friendship ends, and beyond the real loss comes the pain of the story that never came true. A project fails, and along with frustration comes the collapse of the identity that had already imagined itself recognized. A love does not respond the way we hoped, and then we suffer not only because of the absence, but because of the future we had silently designed and that never arrived. Buddha helps us see that the mind creates extra suffering when it turns expectation into a contract with reality. The world never signed that contract, and yet we live as if it were obligated to give us what we imagined. Historically, this makes Buddhism one of the most radical spiritual philosophies ever developed. Instead of promising happiness through achievement, it moves the question inward, toward consciousness itself. The problem is not simply having little or much, winning or losing, rising or falling. The problem is the ignorance that makes us search for lasting stability in everything that is passing away. Kings, merchants, farmers, or ascetics, all are subject to aging, sickness, loss, and death. What changes, according to Buddha, is the way each person relates to these things. The one who lives clinging suffers more, because they treat impermanence as a personal offense. The one who cultivates detachment begins to find peace not because pain disappears, but because they stop fighting against the basic structure of existence. This lesson feels even more relevant today. We live in a culture that constantly encourages attachment to image, validation, consumption, performance, youth, and comparison. Everything invites the mind to keep wanting without end, and the more it wants, the more restless it becomes. Pleasure is brief, emptiness returns, comparison starts again, and anxiety grows. Buddhism enters this scene as an almost revolutionary contrast. It says that the mind will not find peace by collecting more stimulation, but by understanding its own hunger. It will not find peace by defeating every uncertainty, but by stopping the demand for absolute security. It will not find peace by controlling everything, but by letting go of the compulsion to control. In the Dhammapada, the trained mind is compared to something steady, capable of not being carried away by emotional winds at every moment. That image matters deeply. Detachment does not come from a dramatic act of renunciation, but from a deep discipline of observation. You notice desire arising without obeying it right away. You notice anger arising without turning it into your identity. You notice fear arising without letting it rule your whole life. Little by little, a space opens up between impulse and action, and in that space, freedom is born. Not the childish freedom of always getting what you want, but the mature freedom of not being a slave to everything you feel, fear, or expect. That is also why Buddhism points toward the future with growing relevance. In a world of overstimulation, instant gratification, and accelerated frustration, the human mind is likely to become more reactive, more anxious, and more dependent on immediate reward. Without some form of detachment, suffering multiplies, because everything becomes urgent, personal, and unbearable. Buddha offers a way out that goes deeper than simple relief techniques. He invites us to rethink our whole relationship with desire, loss, and impermanence. This does not erase human suffering completely, but it changes its quality. What Buddha reveals is that much of our pain does not come only from life itself, but from the way we try to possess it. We suffer because we cling, demand, and resist. And it is exactly when we begin to let go, not out of lack of love, but out of clarity, that something inside us becomes quiet. Life keeps changing, people keep leaving, and cycles keep closing. But the heart no longer has to break every single time, because it finally learns not to ask eternity from what was always meant to pass. Seneca sees with great clarity one of the most destructive habits of the human mind, suffering ahead of time over things that may never even happen. In his letters to Lucilius, and also in On the Shortness of Life, he shows that a huge part of our anxiety does not come from concrete reality, but from an undisciplined imagination. It is not only pain itself that weighs on us, but the projection of pain. It is not just the real problem, but the mental drama we build around it. Before an event even arrives, we have already lived through it dozens of times inside our minds, enlarged, dramatized, and distorted by fear. And so we keep wasting emotional energy on ghosts created by our own thoughts. This is a deeply modern insight. Many people do not suffer because of what is happening now, but because of what might happen tomorrow, next week, next month, or in some future scenario that has never actually happened. The mind creates losses, failures, humiliations, rejections, and future disasters with impressive detail. The body responds as if all of it were already real. The heart races, sleep disappears, and peace fades away. Seneca saw this mechanism with almost clinical clarity. Much of human suffering comes from the fact that we surrender to imagination without any filter, as if every thought deserved to be believed and every negative possibility were an unavoidable fate. When he says, in one of his most well-known ideas, that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, he is not denying that life can be hard. Seneca is not naive. He knows there are real losses, illness, instability, injustice, death, broken relationships, and deep disappointments. What he is saying is that, on top of these unavoidable pains, we add an extra and unnecessary weight created by the way we think. Instead of facing what is real, we anticipate what we fear. Instead of responding to the present, we become servants of possibilities. Instead of preparing the soul with calm, we wear it out with anxiety. That is exactly where detachment appears in Seneca as a form of emotional intelligence. To detach does not mean to stop caring about life, but to stop sinking into unproductive worries. It means learning to tell the difference between caution and mental torture, between responsibility and rumination, between clear reflection and repetitive fear. In this view, an emotionally intelligent person is not someone who never feels fear, but someone who does not become ruled by it. They understand that thinking about a problem can be useful. Living consumed by it before the time comes is not. This kind of inner maturity takes discipline, because fear often disguises itself as prudence. Many times we say we are preparing ourselves, when in reality we are only feeding anxiety. In On the Shortness of Life, Seneca expands this idea and shows that constant worry does not only steal peace of mind, it steals time itself. Life seems short, not only because the years pass quickly, but because we waste it in mental states that pull us away from the present. We are always occupied with what comes next, with danger, with image, with possible loss, with what others may think, with what has not even happened yet. And so life slips away. A person spends so much time trying to avoid future suffering that they cannot live in the only place where life actually happens, the present. For Seneca, this is a quiet form of existential waste. This teaching becomes especially powerful when we think about history and about life today. How many human decisions were made not out of wisdom, but out of imagined fear? How many preventive wars, persecutions, betrayals, excessive controls, and impulsive actions were born from the inability to deal with uncertainty? And in modern daily life, the same thing happens on a more personal level. People wear themselves down over messages that have not arrived yet, conversations that have not happened yet, rejections that may never come, and career problems that exist only as projection. Some people suffer for a whole week over something that, when it finally happens, lasts 10 minutes and turns out to be far less devastating than the mind had imagined. Seneca offers a different attitude. Train the soul not to enlarge life's blows for no reason. This does not mean denial. It means proportion. When a problem is real, it should be faced firmly. But while it is still only a possibility, it does not deserve to rule your entire inner life. The Stoic wise person does not ignore the future. They simply refuse to live as a prisoner of its darkest versions. This is a lesson of enormous emotional value, because imagination, when left untrained, becomes a tool of self-punishment. It stops being a creative faculty and turns into a machine of threat. In the letters to Lucilius, Seneca also insists that peace depends on reducing our dependence on what we cannot control. Many worries appear because we want to guarantee what will always remain uncertain: lasting good fortune, stable relationships, total safety, and a life without loss. But life offers no such contract. The more we demand complete guarantees, the more anxious we become. Detachment, then, becomes emotional clarity, accepting that life is fragile without turning that fragility into a reason for permanent panic. A mature person does not live numb, but they do not live in constant alarm either. This will matter even more in the future. In an age of too much information, non-stop predictions, real-time crises, and constant stimulation, anxious imagination tends to grow even more. The mind will have more and more material to fear, compare, anticipate, and dramatize. Without inner discipline, a person will be crushed not only by facts, but by the endless possible versions of those facts. In that sense, Seneca seems to speak directly to our time. Be careful that your mind does not become a more hostile place than the world itself. Zhuangzi offers one of the lightest and at the same time deepest forms of freedom ever imagined. The freedom of someone who no longer lives trying to prove anything. In his thought, human suffering grows when we become too rigid around an identity, an image, a name, or a social position. We want to be recognized in a certain way, respected in a certain way, remembered in a certain way, and without realizing it, we begin to live as anxious guardians of a character. The soul grows tired because it has to keep holding up a fixed version of itself in front of a world that is always changing. Zhuangzi steps right into that point and breaks apart that rigidity with irony, poetry, and clarity. Instead of glorifying social importance, he shows how attachment to status can become a prison. Instead of treating recognition as proof of worth, he suggests that the need for it is already a sign of dependence. And instead of insisting on closed, fixed identities, he reveals the fluid nature of existence. One of the most famous marks of his thought is exactly this: dissolving certainties that have become too hard. The well-known butterfly dream, in which he dreams he is a butterfly, and then wonders whether he is Zhuangzi, who dreamed a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that it is Zhuangzi, is not just a beautiful image. It is a radical challenge to our obsession with defining once and for all who we are. For Zhuangzi, the self is not an unmoving fortress. It is something more fluid, more mysterious, and more open to the flow of life. This view has deep consequences. When a person believes they must constantly maintain a solid, admirable, and coherent identity in the eyes of others, they become a slave to psychological maintenance. Every criticism feels threatening. Every failure feels humiliating. Every inner change seems dangerous. Every loss of status feels almost like a loss of existence itself. That is why so many people live exhausted, not just living, but managing their own image without rest. Zhuangzi offers another path. Lightness begins when you stop clinging so tightly to the character, when you no longer need to win every symbolic battle, when you no longer need to show superiority, perfect consistency, or visible greatness at every moment. This lightness is not carelessness about life. It is freedom from social theater. Zhuangzi sees that people suffer greatly by trying to fit into classifications and hierarchies that are, in the end, fragile and temporary. Today, someone is admired. Tomorrow, forgotten. Today, someone holds a high position. Tomorrow, they lose influence. Today, someone is celebrated by a group. Later, rejected by that same group. To make approval your foundation is to build your house on sand. Anyone who depends too much on recognition becomes easy to manipulate. Anyone who needs to prove their value all the time no longer acts spontaneously. They act in search of confirmation. And a life lived that way becomes heavy because everything turns into a display window. Zhuangzi, by contrast, admires a looser kind of existence, one less obsessed with comparison. He often values figures the world would call small, useless, or eccentric, precisely to show that the usual measures of importance are far too narrow. What seems useless may survive better than what is useful to everyone. What seems unimpressive may be in greater harmony with life than what everyone envies. In this, there is a quiet critique of the culture of performance. Not everything that gets applause deserves to be desired. Not everything that looks modest is small. Not everything the world calls success is worth the inner price it demands. This reflection becomes especially powerful when we look at the present. It has never been easier to turn your existence into a display. It has never been more common to measure worth by reaction, visibility, distinction, and public comparison. People are pushed to build a constant narrative about themselves. Who they are, what they have achieved, how they are seen, and how relevant they are. In that setting, Zhuangzi sounds almost revolutionary. He reminds us that there is deep peace in not needing to be impressive all the time. There is a rare freedom in not turning every action into an argument for your own worth. There is a deep kind of rest in not needing to be always right, always admired, always above others. Historically, this also helps explain why traditions like Taoism often offered an alternative to too much formalism, ambition, and social rigidity. While some models valued position, visible duty, and public recognition, Zhuangzi pointed to a wisdom that was more inward and harder to capture. He saw that life becomes poorer when it is reduced to the need for distinction. And that lesson still matters because the search for prestige remains one of the most accepted forms of slavery. Many people believe they are asserting themselves when, in truth, they are only asking for permission to exist. The freedom of someone who does not need to prove anything does not mean having no direction or abandoning responsibility. It simply means that action no longer comes from a hunger for validation. A person still acts, creates, works, loves, and improves themselves, but no longer needs to turn everything into a demonstration. That changes the quality of life itself. Talent becomes less vain. Effort becomes less anxious. Presence becomes more real. Failure stops being devastating because it no longer threatens an inflated character. And even success becomes lighter because it is no longer used to feed a hungry identity. In the future, this wisdom will be even more necessary. The more society organizes itself around visibility, reputation, and symbolic competition, the rarer it will be to find a person capable of living without turning their identity into an exhausting project of existential self-marketing. And for that very reason, that person will be freer, because there will be something the world cannot capture in them, the need to prove. Whoever does not need to prove so much also does not need to fear so much. They can change without feeling like they are betraying themselves. They can make mistakes without falling apart. They can be forgotten without losing themselves. Zhuangzi teaches that lightness begins when we loosen our grip on our name, our image, and our place in the world. Life begins to breathe again when the self stops being a piece of armor that has to be defended all the time. And maybe one of the most beautiful forms of freedom is exactly this: walking through the world without the obsession to convince, impress, or justify your own existence. The person who no longer needs to prove anything discovers a peace that prestige could never give. Nietzsche is one of the most unsettling thinkers when it comes to inner freedom, because he directly attacks one of the most common human dependencies, the need for approval. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, this criticism appears in a powerful, almost fierce way. For Nietzsche, most people do not live according to their own creative strength, but according to the collective gaze, custom, acceptance, applause, and the comfortable morality of the group. This is what he often calls, throughout his philosophy, the herd spirit, a way of living in which the individual would rather be accepted than be true, would rather belong than risk, would rather repeat than create. The central point is harsh, but freeing. As long as you live to please others, your life is never really your own. It becomes organized around the fear of rejection. You choose your words so you will not upset anyone, your desires so you will not seem strange, your path so you will not disappoint, your opinions so you will not be isolated. Little by little, you become socially adjusted, but inwardly distant from yourself. Nietzsche sees this as a silent tragedy, because a person may look well integrated on the outside, but inside they have moved further and further away from their own power. The price of constant approval is too high. You stop becoming who you could have been. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche builds the figure of Zarathustra as someone who comes down from the mountain to speak to humanity, but quickly realizes how difficult it is to communicate a truth that demands rupture. The average person prefers moral comfort over transformation. They would rather hear what confirms their habits than what calls them to overcome themselves. This tension is essential. Nietzsche is not only criticizing other people, he is exposing a universal human temptation, the urge to find safety in collective agreement. The herd here is not just an outside group. It is also an inner tendency to obey what is accepted, even when that obedience makes life smaller. That is why stopping living to please others does not simply mean becoming aggressive, rude, or indifferent to people. That would be a shallow reading. What Nietzsche proposes is something more demanding, giving up psychological submission to approval. It means no longer measuring your value by the number of people who approve of you. It means understanding that the truth of a life cannot be decided by collective applause. The herd approves of what is familiar, predictable, and domesticated. But everything that creates something new first passes through misunderstanding, discomfort, and often contempt. Anyone who needs approval all the time will never have the courage to create their own way of existing. This is one of the reasons Nietzsche places so much value on the idea of overcoming. In Zarathustra, the human being is not meant to be understood as an endpoint, but as a bridge. That means living well is not about passively adapting to the dominant pattern, but about becoming capable of moving beyond inherited limits. But this hurts. It hurts because breaking away from other people's expectations almost always brings loneliness. It hurts because leaving the familiar path requires responsibility. It hurts because once you no longer live to please, you can no longer use the group as an excuse for your own mediocrity. Freedom, for Nietzsche, is not comfortable, but it is alive. Historically, this criticism becomes even more interesting when we think about societies shaped by a morality of conformity. In many contexts, people were taught to see virtue precisely in the things that made them docile, predictable, and guilty for wanting greatness. Nietzsche pushes back against that. He is suspicious of every morality that turns strength into arrogance, independence into selfishness, creation into deviance, and obedience into the highest good. His target is not human community itself, but the kind of culture that weakens the individual in order to make them easier to shape and control. Instead of encouraging growth, it rewards adaptation. This teaching is explosively relevant today. Now the herd does not appear only in traditional morality. It also shows up in the pressure for image, belonging, instant consensus, and public performance. Thousands of people organize their lives around the acceptance of groups, algorithms, social circles, or online communities. The fear of disagreeing, of seeming out of place, of not being validated, shapes behavior in almost invisible ways. Nietzsche would help us see that this is not just sociability. It is refined servitude. When the value of a life depends on the reaction of an audience, autonomy disappears. And without autonomy, there is no creation, only anxious adaptation. But Nietzsche also forces a more uncomfortable question. Who would you be if you did not need to please anyone? Many people have never really explored that, because pleasing others can become such an old habit that it starts to feel like identity. A person no longer knows whether they truly love what they love, or if they simply learn to prefer what would be more accepted. They do not know whether they think for themselves, or just repeat the moral atmosphere around them. They do not know whether they chose, or whether fear chose for them. Thus spoke Zarathustra works as a call to that awakening. Not a peaceful awakening, but a tear in the comfort of conformity. Authentic life begins when the individual accepts the risk of being misunderstood. This does not mean rejecting every community or every form of listening. The problem is not living with others. It is depending on them. The problem is not being loved. It is needing that love as a condition for existence. The problem is not hearing others out. It is living chained to their judgment. Nietzsche wants to free the individual from that submission, so they can affirm life more intensely. And affirming life here means owning your values, your choices, your changes, and even your conflicts without asking permission from the collective chorus. The more the world encourages exposure, comparison, and group conformity, the rarer the courage will be to sustain a life not built for approval. And for that very reason, it will be more valuable. Because in a deep sense, things begin to go right not when everyone likes you, but when you stop depending on that in order to act. The energy once wasted on pleasing others returns to creation. The anxiety for acceptance turns into clarity. The fear of disappointing people loses its power. And then something inside begins to reorganize. Nietzsche is saying that living to please is an elegant way of giving up on yourself. Rejecting the herd's approval is not hatred of people, but faithfulness to your highest possibility. Only when you can bear not fitting perfectly into other people's comfort do you truly begin to be born as an individual. Confucius offers a view of detachment that is very different from the cold indifference people often imagine. For him, maturity does not mean stopping caring about life, about people, or about duty. It means learning not to lose yourself emotionally in everything that happens. In the Analects, the figure of the noble person, the Junzi, appears often, someone who cultivates character, balance, and inner integrity. This ideal is not a person without feeling, but someone who knows how to stay centered, even under the pressures of the world. In that sense, not caring about everything is not hardness of heart, it is balance. This point is essential because there is a huge difference between serenity and apathy. Apathy abandons what matters. Serenity stays committed, but without excess, without despair, and without turning everything into drama. Confucius would never defend a careless life. On the contrary, he deeply values relationships, responsibility, moral discipline, respect in human connections, and faithfulness to what is right. But precisely because he takes these things seriously, he understands that a person needs inner composure. Someone who reacts impulsively to everything does not fulfill their duties better. They only contaminate them with emotional disorder. Someone who lets themselves be consumed by every offense, setback, or conflict loses the sense of proportion needed to act well. In the Analects, self-cultivation is a central theme. The noble person takes care of their own conduct before trying to govern others. They examine themselves, correct themselves, and seek consistency. There is a quiet wisdom here about where to place one's energy. Instead of living obsessed with recognition, with other people's behavior, or with a need to win every conflict, they turn their attention toward what they can actually improve, their own character. That is already a deep form of detachment. Not the detachment of someone who withdraws from life, but of someone who stops wasting strength on what does not deserve to rule the soul. Confucius also shows that emotional excess often comes from a disordered ego. A person becomes too disturbed because they want to be constantly recognized, constantly obeyed, constantly understood, constantly treated as an exception. When that does not happen, they turn small tensions into moral crises. The Confucian wise person takes another path. They do not expect the world to revolve around their sensitivity all the time. This does not mean accepting injustice in silence, but knowing how to respond with proportion. Not every mistake calls for total outrage. Not every disagreement requires a break. Not every failure in another person needs to take over your inner peace. There is a rare maturity in knowing the difference between what truly requires firmness and what only hurts your pride. This view becomes even stronger because Confucius connects serenity with duty. For him, it is not enough to have inner peace if that peace comes from irresponsible distance. True balance lies in remaining ethical, present, and responsible without becoming a slave to agitation. That combination is difficult. On one side, there are people who turn duty into anxious rigidity, trying to control everything, correct everyone, and force order into place. On the other side, there are those who use the language of lightness as an excuse to run from responsibility. Confucius rejects both extremes. Inner balance appears when a person does what needs to be done, but without losing composure, without cultivating resentment, and without turning every challenge into a personal drama. Historically, this helps explain why Confucian thought had so much influence in societies concerned with social order, moral formation, and collective harmony. But the value of this philosophy is not only in systems of external organization. It is also in the sharp understanding that an ethical life requires self-mastery. Families, governments, friendships, and communities all begin to break down when people act out of wounded pride, impulsiveness, and a constant need for self-assertion. In many moments of history, crises grew worse not only because of a lack of intelligence, but because of a lack of temperance. Leaders who could not remain calm confused strength with irritation, authority with vanity, and duty with total control. Confucius shows that true firmness is not moral noise, but consistency. Today, this lesson is especially necessary. We live in a culture that encourages immediate reaction, instant opinion, and emotionally charged sensitivity. Everything invites excess. Too much exposure, too much judgment, too much response, too much offense, too much emotional urgency. In that environment, many people think caring about everything is a sign of moral depth. But often it is just exhaustion disguised as awareness. Confucius would remind us that maturity does not mean reacting to every disturbance as if the world were collapsing. It means keeping enough clarity to act justly without being ruled by the chaos around you. The Analects also suggest that there is dignity in not depending so much on outside validation. The noble person cares more about being worthy than being celebrated. That is decisive. Whoever lives for applause becomes unstable because their peace depends on other people's moods. Whoever lives guided by duty and integrity finds a stronger center. They can hear criticism without falling apart, face misunderstanding without losing balance, and keep doing what is right even without immediate reward. This is a mature kind of detachment, staying committed to what is good without turning recognition into a basic need. In the future, this wisdom will likely become even more valuable. In societies that are increasingly fast and emotionally reactive, it will be rare to find people who can combine responsibility with serenity. And that is exactly why they will make a difference. Because the world does not only need people who feel deeply, it needs people who know how to feel without falling into disorder. It needs people who fulfill their duties without fanaticism, who care without becoming sick over everything, and who remain human without losing their center. At its core, Confucius teaches that not caring about everything is not emotional poverty, but moral refinement. It is learning that the soul should not surrender itself to every noise. It is understanding that real responsibility calls for calm, not loss of control. And it is seeing that serenity does not weaken duty, it makes it wiser. A mature person does not value life any less. They simply stop wasting their heart on what does not deserve to rule it. Schopenhauer begins with an uncomfortable but deeply revealing insight. Human beings cite Human beings suffer because they never stop wanting. In the world as will and representation, he describes existence as being driven by a blind and endless force, the will, which shows up in us as desire, impulse, need, striving, hunger to achieve, possess, keep, and repeat. It is not just about wanting specific things, but about being structurally thrown into a state of dissatisfaction. We want what we do not have. When we get it, we quickly get used to it. Then we want again. And so life swings between lack and boredom, between the frustration of not getting something and the emptiness of already having it. That is why, for Schopenhauer, much of human pain does not come only from the outside world, but from this inner machinery that never truly settles down. At first, this view may seem pessimistic, but it carries a powerful kind of clarity. Schopenhauer realizes that many forms of suffering do not come from extraordinary tragedies, but from the nonstop wanting that rules everyday life. A person imagines they will find peace when they reach a certain position, a certain love, a certain recognition, a certain level of comfort. So they struggle, project, suffer, compare themselves, and stay restless. If they do not get it, they feel incomplete. If they do get it, they discover that the promise of fulfillment was not what they expected. Before long, a new desire takes the place of the old one. The problem was not only the object of desire, but the very structure of dependence on desire itself. That is where stopping caring so much takes on a more radical meaning in Schopenhauer. It is not only about ignoring other people's opinions or cutting down on shallow worries. It is about weakening the tyranny of wanting. It is about refusing to live as a servant of the next promised satisfaction. Because as long as the will completely rules consciousness, peace becomes almost impossible. Everything turns into urgency. Everything feels like a condition for well-being. Everything becomes a lack that must be filled. And a life organized that way will inevitably become more anxious, more frustrated, and more vulnerable. Schopenhauer does not deny that some desires are natural or unavoidable. What he reveals is the spiritual cost of living under their control. Constant desire narrows vision. A person stops seeing what is and only sees what they still do not have. They stop living in the present and begin living for a projected satisfaction. They stop contemplating and only chase. When this logic is taken to the extreme, it produces a kind of silent slavery. The individual believes they are chasing happiness, when in fact they are being dragged around by a hunger that keeps reorganizing itself. This diagnosis fits the modern world with remarkable precision. We live in a culture that turns desire into a permanent engine. There is always something missing. More success, more validation, more beauty, more experience, more consumption, more attention, more performance, more pleasure. Dissatisfaction is no longer seen as a problem. It is exploited as fuel. The modern person is constantly reminded that they should want more, become more, show more, achieve more. Schopenhauer would help us see the cost of that. A society built on the constant stimulation of desire does not produce inner freedom. It produces refined dependence. And the more desires multiply, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between real need and manufactured restlessness. In this sense, reducing desire does not make life poorer. It makes life lighter. Schopenhauer sees in art, contemplation, and certain forms of self-denial moments in which the will loses its grip and consciousness can breathe. When someone contemplates something without wanting to possess it, use it, or dominate it, they experience a rare pause in craving. When they stop measuring everything by its immediate usefulness to their desire, a space of quiet opens up. It is as if, for a moment, existence stops being a race and becomes vision. That relief does not solve every human problem, but it reveals a precious possibility. It is possible to live without fully obeying the tyranny of wanting. There is also an ethical side to this philosophy. A person who wants too much tends to turn the world and other people into instruments. People become means. Relationships become extensions of personal hunger. Love gets contaminated by possession. Work gets contaminated by vanity. Success gets contaminated by comparison. So reducing desire is not only a strategy for personal well-being, but also a way of reducing the violence that comes from endless craving. A person who is less dominated by wanting is also less likely to turn everything into something to be owned. Historically, this clarity helps explain why Schopenhauer had such a strong influence on thinkers, artists, and traditions that also distrusted the idea that happiness comes from constant satisfaction. There is a certain closeness, though not an identical one, with some Buddhist insights. The idea that attachment and endless craving feed suffering. In Schopenhauer, however, this appears in modern philosophical language, with a hardness that strips away romantic illusions about the human search for completion in the world. He tears down the illusion that living well means getting everything you want. On the contrary, maybe living better means wanting less, depending less, and asking less from the world as a source of salvation. The more technology, the market, and culture encourage comparison and instant desire, the more people will feel trapped in a chronic sense of insufficiency. Without some deliberate weakening of the will, the mind will remain condemned to a permanent state of hunger. And permanent hunger cannot coexist with peace. Schopenhauer offers a severe but honest answer. Peace will not come from multiplying the objects of desire, but from reducing the power desire has over us. The relief Schopenhauer speaks of begins when wanting stops being sovereign. When a person no longer runs after everything that promises pleasure, status, or fulfillment. When they realize that much of their pain came from treating every impulse as an absolute need. Here, stopping caring so much means something deeply freeing. Not handing your soul over to every new desire that appears. It means weakening the tyranny of the will so that life stops being only pursuit and becomes, at least in part, presence. The Bhagavad Gita offers one of the most powerful teachings ever expressed about inner freedom. To act with complete seriousness, but without chaining yourself to the result. This idea stands at the center of the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna when the warrior, overwhelmed by anguish, hesitates in the face of duty. The battlefield there is not just an external setting. It also represents the human struggle of acting in an uncertain world where we can almost never fully control the consequences of what we do. Krishna then presents a decisive wisdom. You have a right to action, but not to the fruits of action. In other words, your commitment should be to what must be done, not to an obsession with guaranteeing perfect outcomes. This is a deeply demanding lesson because it goes against one of the central impulses of the human mind. Most of the time, we act while already emotionally attached to what we hope to get in return. Recognition, success, reward, victory, confirmation, security. It is not enough to act. We want to secure the result. It is not enough to plant. We want to control the harvest. And that is exactly where much of anxiety begins. The mind stops living in the action itself and becomes a prisoner of the future. The present, which is the only place where action really happens, gets invaded by expectation. Instead of presence, there is tension. Instead of clarity, there is fear. Instead of surrender, there is calculation. In the Bhagavad Gita, acting without attachment to results does not mean acting without purpose. It also does not mean passivity or indifference. Krishna does not tell Arjuna to abandon his duty, run away from conflict, or do nothing. On the contrary, he insists that action is necessary. The point is something else. Action should come from inner alignment, responsibility, and a clear understanding of duty, not from psychological dependence on what comes afterward. That makes this teaching extraordinarily mature, because it recognizes two truths at the same time. A human being must act, but will never fully control the fruits of that action. This distinction carries enormous power. How often does suffering come not from the action itself, but from attachment to the expected return? A person does the right thing, but becomes desperate because they are not recognized. They love sincerely, but destroy themselves because they cannot guarantee it will be returned. They work with dedication, but lose their peace because success does not arrive on the timetable they wanted. They make fair decisions, but become emotionally exhausted trying to control how others will interpret them. The Gita breaks apart that prison. It teaches that the dignity of action should not depend completely on the world's response. You do what must be done because it is right, necessary, and true, not because the universe promised you a custom-made result. This teaching becomes even stronger when we understand Arjuna's condition. He is paralyzed by the complexity of the situation, by the emotional weight of the consequences, and by anticipated pain. And that is deeply human. Many times, we do not fail to act because of laziness, but because of too much attachment. We want so much certainty that everything will work out, so much guarantee that we will not suffer, so much proof that the outcome will be fair, that we end up frozen. Krishna then offers a path that is not simplistic, but freeing. Do what belongs to you with clarity, and let go of what lies outside your control. This principle turns action into a spiritual practice because it moves the center of life away from control and toward integrity. Historically, this vision had enormous impact precisely because it offered an ethic of action in the middle of impermanence. The Bhagavad Gita is not speaking to someone withdrawn from the world, but to someone immersed in conflict, responsibility, and moral dilemma. That makes its message very concrete. You do not need to run away from life to find peace. It is possible to act intensely in the world without being consumed by it. That may be one of the most admirable parts of the text. It does not place spirituality against action, but instead offers a way to act without becoming a slave to the outcome. Today, this lesson feels almost indispensable. We live in a culture that measures everything by performance, return, metrics, comparison, and reward. People are taught to value visible results more than the inner quality of the action itself. That creates a generation that is tired, anxious, and often disconnected from the real meaning of what it does. People study for the prize, work for validation, create for reaction, and love while expecting guarantees. Little by little, action loses its own dignity and becomes only a tool for getting something. The Bhagavad Gita enters as a deep correction. Do well what needs to be done, but do not hand your peace over to what does not fully depend on you. This wisdom also helps us avoid two dangerous extremes. The first is obsession, acting as if the value of your whole life depended on one single outcome. The second is giving up, abandoning action because the result is uncertain. The Gita rejects both. It teaches involvement without slavery, discipline without desperation, and dedication without possessiveness. That changes the quality of existence. The effort remains, but becomes cleaner. Courage remains, but is less polluted by fear. Persistence remains, but without fanaticism. And maybe for the first time, a person experiences something rare, working, deciding, and living with intensity without being eaten alive by anxiety about the return. The more the world speeds up the logic of immediate reward, the harder it becomes to act with serenity. The pressure for visible results tends to wear down patience, consistency, and mental health itself. Without detachment, every attempt becomes a test of personal worth. Every failure feels like a sentence. Every delay feels unbearable. The Bhagavad Gita offers a deeper alternative. Peace is not found in always securing the result, but in purifying your relationship with action. In learning to do what belongs to you and letting go of what belongs to the larger course of life. Acting without attachment to results is a high form of freedom. It means staying committed, but not possessed. It means giving your best without turning the outcome into an idol. It means understanding that the result matters, but it cannot be your master. And when that understanding matures, something changes deeply. You stop living as a hostage to what comes later, and finally begin to act with greater wholeness in the present. Montaigne is a rare master of clarity without harshness. In the essays, he does not present himself as an unreachable wise man, or as someone who has overcome every human contradiction. On the contrary, he writes from his own experience, his own hesitation, and his own limits. And that is exactly what makes his philosophy feel so alive. Instead of offering a heroic image of the human being, Montaigne invites us to accept the human condition as it is, imperfect, unstable, vulnerable, and still worthy of being lived with more lightness. His practical wisdom begins there. We suffer a great deal because we demand from ourselves, from others, and from life a kind of solidity that simply does not exist. One of Montaigne's great strengths is his refusal of exaggeration. He sees that the human mind has a constant tendency to dramatize, turning discomfort into catastrophe, uncertainty into panic, failure into final condemnation. Instead of living life as it really comes, we create a mental theater in which everything becomes bigger, more threatening, and more absolute than it really is. Montaigne responds to this with a kind of calm intelligence. He does not minimize human pain, but he puts it back into proportion. Not everything is as decisive as it seems. Not every failure defines a life. Not every emotional shift is a sign of ruin. In his thought, there is a constant invitation to breathe within imperfection, instead of fighting it in desperation. This attitude appears in a very concrete way in his writing. Montaigne talks about illness, death, friendship, education, vanity, fear, and the inconsistency of judgment, always with an unusual mixture of honesty and composure. He does not place himself above the human condition. He steps into it, and that itself is already a form of detachment. Because for Montaigne, living lightly means giving up the fantasy of perfection. It means accepting that human beings change their minds, contradict themselves, make mistakes, get overly emotional, grow tired, waste time, fear the future, and fail themselves. Instead of turning all of this into a moral scandal, he proposes a more humble and more intelligent relationship with our own fragility. This is a precious point. Many people suffer not only because of life's real problems, but because they are ashamed of being human. They have trouble accepting their own fear, their own limits, their own slowness, their own confusion. They want to be always clear, strong, resolved, and consistent. And when they cannot, they go to war with themselves. Montaigne breaks that logic with elegance. He suggests that maturing does not mean becoming a statue of strength, but learning how to live better with what in us is incomplete. Wisdom is not found in eliminating the human condition, but in living inside it without so much desperation. In the essays, there is also a healthy distrust of rigid certainties. Montaigne knows that life is far too unstable to fit into absolute systems. Our judgments change, circumstances surprise us, plans fail, the body ages, and chance intervenes. Instead of revolting against this, he develops a kind of inner flexibility. This is a great art of living. Anyone who demands total guarantees from existence lives in permanent frustration. Anyone who accepts uncertainty as an unavoidable part of experience becomes less fragile, not because they stop feeling, but because they no longer expect from life a consistency that life could never give. Historically, this attitude has enormous value. Montaigne wrote during a time marked by religious wars, fanaticism, and ideological violence. In that kind of setting, his voice is almost an antidote to rigidity. While the world tears itself apart over absolute convictions, he insists on moderation, doubt, self-observation, and recognition of human limits. This is not intellectual weakness, it is moral depth. He sees that much suffering begins when human beings stop accepting their limits and start acting as if they had access to total truth. Lightness, then, is not superficiality. It is a form of wisdom that keeps the soul from becoming too hard. This lesson is especially needed today. We live in a time that demands constant performance, a perfectly defined identity, immediate opinions, visible productivity, and an image of control that almost no one really has. In that setting, people become harsher and harsher with themselves. They do not accept doubt, slowness, ambivalence, or partial failure. Everything turns into proof of inadequacy. Montaigne would offer a valuable contrast. Maybe life becomes more livable when you stop treating it like a courtroom. Maybe much of the weight you carry does not come from the facts themselves, but from the grand and cruel way you interpret them. He also teaches something essential about death and finitude. Instead of turning mortality into a paralyzing terror, Montaigne tries to integrate it into life. Knowing that we are limited should not crush us, but make us more sober, more attentive to what matters, more willing to stop wasting energy on fantasies of total control. There is a deep lightness in recognizing that we do not control everything. We will not understand everything, and we will not complete everything. Human life is partial by nature. Constantly resisting, that is one of the sources of our suffering. In the future, Montaigne's wisdom may become even more valuable. The more the world demands emotional perfection, constant consistency, and public performance, the more freeing it will be to find a philosophy that allows us to be human without overwhelming guilt. The lightness he proposes is not irresponsible. It does not tell us to abandon effort, ethics, or self-care. It simply reminds us that existence is already difficult enough without turning it into a permanent drama. Not every failure needs to become an identity crisis. Not every uncertainty needs to become despair. Not every imperfection needs to be lived as defeat. At its core, Montaigne teaches the art of not making life harder than it already is. And that is enormous. Accepting limits, imperfections, and uncertainty does not make us smaller. It makes us more real, and maybe more free. Because lightness begins when we stop demanding from ourselves and from the world what could never be fully given. Instead of dramatizing everything so much, we begin to live with more balance, more humor, more patience, and more truth. That may be one of the most elegant forms of wisdom, to look at the human condition without illusions, but also without cruelty. Jiddu Krishnamurti goes straight to one of the quietest roots of human suffering. The mind is almost never at peace because it lives trapped in psychological patterns that it keeps feeding itself. In the first and last freedom, he insists that the central problem is not only in outside circumstances, but in the inner structure of comparison, fear, dependence, and the search for approval. The mind suffers because it rarely looks at itself clearly. Most of the time it measures itself, projects itself, defends itself, adapts itself, and worries about the image it presents to the world. And in that nonstop movement, it loses freedom. Krishnamurti sees something deeply relevant to our time. Comparison eats away at a person from the inside. From an early age, people learn to measure their value against others. Who is ahead? Who is more admired? Who seems smarter, more attractive, more successful, more recognized, more secure? From that point on, life stops being an experience and becomes a psychological competition. The mind no longer observes itself directly. It observes itself through contrast. And that contrast creates anxiety, envy, inadequacy, and the fear of falling behind. Instead of simply existing, the person lives evaluating themselves. Instead of understanding their own reality, they try to reach an idealized image of who they think they should be. For Krishnamurti, this mechanism is devastating because it splits the mind against itself. There is what you are, and there is what you think you should be. There is what you feel, and there is what you believe would be acceptable to feel. There is your real condition, and there is the improved image you try to reach in order to deserve value. Out of that division comes conflict. The mind never rests because it is always trying to become something else. And this constant effort is socially seen as progress, when many times it is only refined suffering. Krishnamurti breaks apart that logic in a radical way. As long as you live in comparison, there is no inner freedom. There is only movement of escape. Fear is another central pillar of this psychological prison. Not only the concrete fear of real dangers, but psychological fear. Fear of losing, of failing, of not being loved, of not measuring up, of disappointing others, of being nobody, of not mattering. This fear slips into almost everything. It guides professional, emotional, spiritual, and social choices. Many people do not live according to their own perception, but according to what they fear losing if they are honest. And what is most unsettling is that this fear often disguises itself as caution, responsibility, or maturity. Krishnamurti wants to expose this prison without softening it. A mind ruled by fear may look organized on the outside, but inside it is conditioned, narrow, and dependent. In the first and last freedom, he also insists that the search for approval is a deep form of slavery. When the value of a life depends continuously on the recognition of others, autonomy disappears. A person begins to adjust thoughts, behavior, and even feelings to other people's expectations. They want to be accepted, validated, confirmed. And that may seem normal, even unavoidable, but for Krishnamurti, it is exactly one of the greatest obstacles to psychological freedom. Because the moment you need applause in order to feel that you exist, you are no longer living from yourself. You are living from the reflection you hope to produce. This criticism is especially powerful because he does not offer easy comfort. Krishnamurti does not simply say, "Stop caring" by force of will. He goes deeper. What must be understood is the way the mind works. It is not enough to swap one behavior for another, nor to adopt a detached pose. It is necessary to directly see the movement of comparison, fear, and the search for approval while it is happening, to see without running away, to see without justifying, to see without condemning. For him, real transformation does not come from discipline imposed from the outside, but from clear perception. When the mind deeply understands the nature of its own prison, something begins to dissolve. That makes his philosophy very different from purely moral approaches. Krishnamurti is not interested only in saying what is right or wrong. He wants to show how psychological suffering is built moment by moment. Comparison creates insufficiency. Fear creates dependence. The search for approval creates inner falseness. And all of this forms a fragmented, tense self that is always looking for security. But that security never arrives because it is being sought on unstable ground, in the opinions of others, in image, in superiority, in an imagined future. Psychological freedom, then, is not the achievement of a stronger ego. It is the weakening of the structures that keep the mind in conflict. Today, this way of thinking feels almost surgical. We live in a culture that encourages constant comparison, permanent exposure, and instant validation. It has never been easier to measure yourself against other people. It has never been more common to build an identity around image, performance, and acceptance. The result is a mind that is increasingly tired, reactive, and divided. Krishnamurti helps us see that this is not only a social or technological problem, but an existential one. The modern mind has been trained to look outside for something that could only arise from inner clarity. The more it depends on approval, the more insecure it becomes. The more it compares, the further it moves from what it is. There is also a future dimension to all of this. If human beings keep deepening these patterns without awareness, they will likely live with greater and greater levels of anxiety, alienation, and estrangement from themselves. But Krishnamurti points to a rare possibility, a mind that can observe without fear of seeing itself, a mind that does not need to be superior in order to have worth, that does not need to please in order to exist, that does not need to escape itself through endless ideals. This would be a deeply revolutionary kind of freedom, because it would depend neither on circumstance nor on collective approval. What Krishnamurti calls psychological freedom begins when the mind stops hurting itself through comparison, stops organizing itself around fear, and stops begging for recognition in order to feel real. It is not a path of becoming harder, but of becoming clearer. It is not learning how to look free, but seeing clearly what keeps you trapped. And maybe that is one of the deepest forms of peace, when the mind no longer needs to measure itself, defend itself, and prove itself all the time, and can finally simply be. Sartre touches on something deeply uncomfortable because it is so personal. Many people do not really live, they manage themselves. Instead of choosing freely, they begin calculating how they will be seen, interpreted, and judged. Little by little, life stops being an experience and turns into a performance. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre shows that the human being is not born with a ready-made script. We are thrown into freedom, forced to choose, forced to answer for what we make of ourselves. And that is frightening, because freedom is not comfortable. It is easier to hide behind the opinions of others, behind the expectations of family, the group, or society, and to face the anxiety of deciding for yourself. That is exactly where the fear of judgment becomes a prison. When a person lives trying to please, they no longer ask, "What makes sense for me?" but instead, "How will this sound? What will people think? Will this disappoint someone? Will this make me seem out of place?" That shift may seem small, but it changes everything. Life stops being guided by conviction and starts being guided by fear. And for Sartre, that is a form of escape. Not a physical escape, but an escape from yourself. A person keeps acting, working, relating, smiling, and even seeming functional. But inside, they have already started abandoning themselves. Sartre understood that other people really do have power over us. The gaze of the other is not neutral. When someone looks at us, we are not only perceived, we also feel exposed, fixed, almost turned into an object. Suddenly, we are no longer only living consciousness, movement, and inner life. We become an image. We become what the other person may be thinking about us. And this is one of the most uncomfortable moments in existence, when we begin seeing ourselves through the mirror of someone else's judgment. One comment is enough. One judgment is enough. One act of contempt is enough. And a person can spend hours, days, or even years trying to correct an impression, defend an image, or avoid any action that might bring rejection. This prison is much more common than it seems. It appears in the young person who chooses a career path not because they love it, but because they want approval. It appears in the one who stays in empty relationships just to avoid being judged. It appears in the person who suppresses their own personality to fit into an environment. It appears in the one who spends a whole life trying not to disappoint others, and in the end, no longer even knows what they truly wanted. The fear of judgment slowly shrinks the soul. A person keeps existing, but in a reduced version of themselves. They no longer dare much, no longer speak with wholeness, no longer create with courage, no longer move with authenticity. Everything first passes through the filter of acceptance. Sartre draws attention to something harsh, but necessary. Many times we use other people as an excuse not to accept our own freedom. We say we had no choice, that we needed to meet expectations, that acting differently was impossible. But in many cases, what was really there was fear. Fear of disappointing others, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, fear of not belonging. That fear can be so strong that a person would rather give themselves up than face the risk of not being approved. And this is where Sartre becomes uncomfortable, because he does not let us hide this process behind nice-sounding phrases. Living to please may look like kindness, maturity, or good sense. But many times, it is only emotional dependence dressed up as adaptation. What is most distressing is that this prison does not always come from open pressure. In many cases, no one is directly forcing us. We are the ones carrying the judge inside. We are the ones anticipating other people's gaze before it even appears. We are the ones censoring a desire, a choice, a word, or a change because we already imagine the possible disapproval. That makes the issue even deeper. The prison is not only outside us, it has been internalized. The other person no longer needs to watch us all the time because we have learned to watch ourselves. And that may be one of the most sophisticated forms of imprisonment. That is why accepting your own freedom takes real courage. Not the loud, dramatic kind of courage that wants to look rebellious, but the quiet courage to stand by a choice without depending on applause. The courage to endure misunderstanding without falling apart inside. The courage not to make approval a condition for existing with dignity. Sartre is not defending selfishness or contempt for others. He is saying something more serious. You cannot hand over to other people's judgment the right to define who you are. Because the moment that happens, your life is no longer being lived from the inside out. It is being shaped from the outside in. We live in a time when many people feel watched all the time. Everything seems to be under evaluation. Appearance, opinion, performance, presence, silence, position. And the more human beings get used to living exposed, the easier it becomes to confuse visibility with value. Sartre would seem almost prophetic in front of this, because the problem is not only being seen, the problem is beginning to exist for the sake of the gaze. It is turning your life into a response. It is losing spontaneity, firmness, and inner truth, because everything has to pass through the invisible courtroom of acceptance. But Sartre also points toward a way out, even if it is difficult. The way out is not controlling what others think. That would be impossible. It is also not pretending that judgment does not hurt. It does hurt. The way out is to stop organizing your entire existence around avoiding it at any cost. It is recognizing that freedom involves risk. There will always be people who do not understand. There will always be people who disapprove. There will always be people who reduce you to an unfair image. The question is, will your life be built around that threat or around your responsibility for what you choose to be? Sartre shows that fear of judgment imprisons us because it convinces us to trade freedom for acceptance. And that trade may seem safe, but it demands a devastating price. You keep being accepted while slowly disappearing. Accepting your own freedom, then, means stopping asking permission to exist. It means accepting that the gaze of others may affect you, but it must not rule you. It means understanding that an authentic life will never be completely protected from criticism, rejection, or discomfort. But even so, it is still worth more than a whole life built only to please. Miyamoto Musashi speaks of a kind of strength that does not depend on agitation, posturing, or noise. In the Book of Five Rings, the center of discipline is not only the technique of the sword, but the quality of mind that guides action. And for that mind to be effective, it cannot waver with every stimulus, fear, or vanity. When a person becomes too distracted by whatever throws them off inside, their actions lose precision. They see worse, decide worse, and react worse. That is why, in Musashi, stopping caring so much about distractions, fears, and the need to prove yourself is not coldness. It is a refinement of presence. This point matters because many people imagine that strength means emotional intensity. Musashi suggests almost the opposite. A mind that is overly concerned with winning, impressing, proving its worth, or avoiding humiliation is already at a disadvantage. It is no longer fully present in what it is doing. Part of its energy has been taken over by fantasies, fears, and ego-driven impulses. The hand may still act, but consciousness is already divided. Instead of clearly seeing the situation, the person is also fighting their own inner turmoil. And when that happens, even real talent can get lost in hesitation. In Musashi's world, precision comes from mental simplicity. Seeing what is right in front of you, without being dragged around by vanity or fear, is a high form of power. The warrior who wants too badly to look brilliant becomes predictable. The one who fears mistakes too much becomes slow. The one who gets trapped by their own image loses flexibility. The Book of Five Rings values exactly the ability not to become stuck in fixations. The mind should not harden around one single possibility, shrink in the face of risk, or inflate itself with the need for recognition. When it stays clear, alert, and free from too much attachment, action finds its most exact course. This applies far beyond combat. Just think about how often everyday life is damaged, not by lack of ability, but by too much inner disturbance. A person knows what needs to be done, but gets distracted by comparison. They have a decision to make, but become paralyzed by fear of failure. They could act clearly, but waste energy trying to appear admirable. Instead of presence, everything becomes performance. Instead of focus, anxiety. Instead of direction, mental noise. Musashi helps us see that precision is not only a matter of external skill. It is the result of a mind that does not get pulled in every direction. There is also a clear distrust of vanity in his thought. Vanity is not only enjoying admiration, it is allowing the desire to seem important to interfere with your contact with reality. And that is dangerous because vanity distorts perception. A person who wants to prove superiority starts acting for the audience, not for the truth of the situation. They want the beautiful strike, the dramatic victory, the untouched image. But reality rarely respects our pride. Musashi knew that attachment to appearance weakens the warrior because it makes them less adaptable. Anyone who has to protect their image all the time becomes rigid. And rigidity, when faced with reality, usually breaks. Fear appears as another source of wavering. Not the natural fear that comes in difficult situations, but the kind of fear that takes over the center of the mind and starts ruling everything. When that happens, a person stops acting from clarity and starts acting from anxious self-protection. They see too much threat, overcalculate, expect defeat, and hesitate. Musashi does not propose eliminating all emotion by brute force, but cultivating a discipline in which fear is not the master of action. A steady mind is not one that never feels trembling, but one that does not hand control over to that trembling. Historically, this teaching was born in a context of real conflict, martial discipline, and concrete danger, but it would be shallow to reduce it to a combat manual. What makes Musashi so lasting is that he saw something universal. Any human action loses quality when the mind is divided between what it needs to do and what it fears, desires, or wants to display. This applies to leadership, art, work, study, moral decisions, and human relationships. A wavering mind scatters itself. A centered mind sees the moment, the right measure, and the necessary movement more clearly. Today, this lesson feels especially urgent. We live surrounded by distraction, stimulation, comparison, and pressure around image. Almost everything invites the mind to scatter. Notifications, performance anxiety, the need for immediate response, fear of making mistakes in public, and constant desire for validation. In that environment, the mind loses steadiness easily. It jumps from one worry to another, from one vanity to another, from one fear to another. Musashi would sound severe in the face of this. He would remind us that precise action requires a mind that is less occupied with itself. The more tightly you hold on to fear and vanity, the less free you are to act with precision. There is also something deeply human in this discipline. Stopping caring so much about distractions does not mean living numb. It means choosing what deserves to rule your attention. Stopping caring so much about vanity does not mean rejecting dignity, but refusing to make appearance your priority. Stopping caring so much about certain fears does not mean denying vulnerability, but not allowing it to paralyze the necessary act. Little by little, action becomes cleaner, less contaminated by ego, less delayed by insecurity, less wasted in noise. In the future, this wisdom will likely become even more valuable. The more the world creates distraction and psychological instability, the rarer it will be to find someone with a mind steady enough to see without getting lost, decide without theater, and act without wavering at every impulse. And that is exactly why such a person will have a different kind of strength. Not the strength of aggression, but the strength of exact presence. At its core, Musashi teaches that precision does not come only from training the hands, but from the silence of the mind. When you stop giving too much importance to distractions, fears, and vanity, something begins to reorganize inside you. Your vision becomes clearer. Your movements become simpler. Your decisions become more direct. And then action finally stops being a reflection of inner turmoil and becomes the expression of a whole and steady consciousness. Viktor Frankl touches on a decisive point in human experience. Inner peace cannot depend on the promise that the world will be fair, comfortable, or perfectly in order. In man's search for meaning, this truth takes on almost unbearable force because it does not come from abstract theory, but from the concrete experience of extreme suffering. Frankl shows that even under inhuman conditions, one last freedom still remains to the human being, the freedom to choose one's attitude toward circumstances. This does not remove pain, erase tragedy, or romanticize suffering, but it reveals something deeply transformative. Life begins to change when you stop demanding that everything around you be in order before you allow yourself to find some kind of peace. This idea is hard to accept because it goes against a very common impulse. Most of the time, we think like this: I'll be okay when this gets resolved. I'll have peace when my life gets back on track. I'll be able to live calmly when people are the way I expect them to be. When the world stops frustrating me, then I'll rest. The problem is that this kind of thinking puts the soul in a state of permanent dependence. Peace is always delayed, always conditional, always held hostage by an ideal situation that rarely arrives completely. Frankl breaks this logic with firmness. If you can only live well when circumstances cooperate, then your inner life is in the hands of chance. In man's search for meaning, he observes that suffering becomes even more devastating when a person completely loses their sense of meaning. It is not only pain that destroys, but the emptiness felt in the face of it. That is why his reflection goes beyond simple psychological endurance. The point is not to harden yourself against the world, but to find a posture that makes existence bearable, and in some cases, even morally elevated, even in the middle of chaos. Frankl sees that anyone who lives demanding perfect conditions from reality before they can maintain dignity becomes too fragile for real life. Because real life fails, wounds, disappoints, disrupts, and takes things away. And if the soul only knows how to breathe in comfort, it breaks when faced with the world's unavoidable imperfection. This is a lesson of enormous value in everyday life. Many people suffer not only because of the problem itself, but because of the silent revolt that the problem exists at all. They do not suffer only because of the delay, but because the delay should not be happening. They do not suffer only because others fail, but because they imagined people would always be mature, fair, and consistent. They do not suffer only because of life's pain, but because they demand that life be smooth and orderly. Frankl helps us see that there comes a point when this demand becomes a prison. When you expect the world to be perfect before you can live in peace, you turn your own serenity into a hostage of factors you will never fully control. This does not mean conformity. Frankl is not saying you should passively accept everything that happens or give up the effort to build a better life. That would be a serious distortion of his work. What he shows is something deeper. Human dignity cannot depend entirely on circumstances. You can work to change what is unjust, improve what is possible, and correct what is within your reach. But while that has not yet happened, your inner life does not need to remain completely destroyed. There is a quiet strength in refusing to hand your peace over to the condition that the world must constantly cooperate with your desires. This vision becomes even more powerful because Frankl rejects both absolute pessimism and naive optimism. He does not promise that everything will work out in the shallow sense of that phrase. Life may still remain difficult. There may be irreparable losses. There may be pain without any satisfying explanation. And still, something can go right at a deeper level. A person does not have to be inwardly destroyed by what they did not choose. They can keep a center, a sense of meaning, and a responsibility toward existence itself. And that changes everything, because suffering stops being only crushing weight and can, in some cases, become an occasion for moral strength. Today, this lesson is especially necessary. We live in a culture that often sells the idea that peace is the result of perfect circumstances, the ideal routine, ideal relationships, ideal body, ideal recognition, ideal stability. Since almost none of that is ever fully and constantly achieved, the result is permanent anxiety. People wait for the right life before they allow themselves to breathe. They wait for the perfect moment before they allow themselves any inner rest. Frankl would remind us that this delay is dangerous. Anyone who makes peace dependent on outside perfection risks never finding it, because reality will always bring some lack, some surprise, some pain. This wisdom will likely become even more important in the future. The faster, more uncertain, and more demanding the world becomes, the more tempting it will be to believe that we can only live well after everything has been solved. But that will never happen completely. There will always be instability, frustration, unexpected change, and human fragility. The decisive question, then, will not be how to build a world completely free from imperfection, an impossible task, but how to form human beings who do not depend entirely on those conditions in order to remain whole. Frankl offers exactly that answer. Human strength appears when a person recognizes that circumstances affect, wound, and limit us, but do not have the right to fully define the meaning of our existence. Frankl's message is a high form of freedom. Not the freedom to control everything, but the freedom not to kneel inwardly before the imperfection of the world. In a deeper and truer sense, things begin to go right when you stop demanding that reality become flawless before you allow yourself to live in peace. This does not erase pain. It does not turn suffering into something beautiful. It does not remove the need to struggle. But it keeps your soul from spending its whole life waiting for an ideal universe before it can begin to breathe. And maybe that is one of the rarest strengths a human being can develop, to keep seeking what is good without making the world's perfection the condition for remaining whole. Sun Tzu understood something that many people still ignore. Losing your calm is almost always the same as losing your advantage. In the art of war, strategic intelligence does not come from haste, wounded pride, or the need to respond immediately to every threat. It comes from clarity. And clarity is only possible when the mind is not taken over by anxiety or impulsiveness. Anyone who gets carried away by panic sees less, understands things worse, and acts in a more predictable way. But the person who keeps their calm can read the situation better, notice hidden movements, and make more precise decisions. This teaching goes far beyond the battlefield. Sun Tzu is not only talking about war in the military sense, but about conflict, decision-making, positioning, and the wise use of energy. And here his vision is almost ruthless. The enemy that most often ruins action is not only outside us, but inside us. It is rushing. It is the urge to react before understanding. It is the emotional need to win right away, prove strength right away, respond right away. When the mind enters that state, it no longer acts with strategic intelligence, but with emotional contamination. And a person who is emotionally contaminated becomes easy to provoke, easy to manipulate, and easy to defeat. Sun Tzu deeply values the ability not to hand your decisions over to the heat of the moment. That is crucial, because impulsiveness creates the illusion of strength, when many times it is only lack of control. Someone who explodes quickly may look intense, but is not always effective. Someone who rushes may seem brave, but often is only acting without vision. Calmness, on the other hand, is often confused with slowness or passivity, when in many cases it is actually the highest form of control. A calm person is not standing still out of weakness. They are seeing more. They are resisting the urge to act badly just for the sake of acting fast. They are protecting clarity. That clarity is an advantage, because an anxious person tends to interpret everything in a distorted way. They see too much threat where there may only be noise. Or they see opportunity where there is actually a trap. Anxiety changes a person's sense of proportion. It makes small signs look huge and, at the same time, makes it harder to notice what really matters. The anxious mind wants quick relief, and because of that, it becomes less able to tolerate observation, waiting, and calculation. Sun Tzu would recognize this pattern immediately. Anyone who cannot handle tension without rushing has already given away part of the game, because now they are acting not according to reality, but according to inner urgency. In everyday life, this happens all the time. Someone receives criticism and reacts on impulse, making the situation worse. Someone else faces a problem at work and, driven by urgency, takes the first option just to escape the anxiety. Another person goes through an emotional crisis and turns a few minutes of insecurity into permanent decisions. In all these cases, the problem is not only outside. It is the inability to stay calm long enough to see clearly. Sun Tzu would show that acting intelligently often means not reacting right away. It means refusing the temptation to let emotion become the one giving orders. There is also an important side to this when it comes to reading other people. In the art of war, understanding the terrain, the timing, and the opponent is essential. But that is only possible for someone who is not overly absorbed in themselves. Impulsiveness makes a person look less at the situation and more at their own inner state. They want to release tension, defend pride, silence fear. And while doing that, they stop noticing the real movement in front of them. Calmness, on the other hand, creates space for sharper perception. Someone who is less agitated inside can notice patterns, intentions, openings, risks, and rhythms much more accurately. Historically, this wisdom had enormous value because wars, political struggles, and major decisions have always been won or lost not only through brute force, but through emotional control. How many leaders fell because they confused irritation with power? How many conflicts became worse because someone could not bear to wait, listen, or calculate more carefully? How many defeats began the exact moment wounded pride demanded an immediate response? Sun Tzu understood that the advantage rarely belongs to the loudest person. More often, it belongs to the clearest one. Today, this lesson is even more relevant. We live in an environment that encourages instant reaction, immediate opinion, quick response, and rushed positioning. Almost everything pushes the mind into a state of non-stop alert. In that setting, calmness has become rare, and that is exactly why it has become an advantage. Anyone who can avoid being dragged around by collective anxiety already sees better than most people. Anyone who does not need to answer in the heat of the moment is already thinking with more quality. Anyone who is not ruled by impulsiveness protects something that is extremely valuable today: discernment. But it is important to understand that this calm is not emotional coldness or moral indifference. Sun Tzu is not defending apathy. He is defending inner command. A calm mind can still be firm, fast, and decisive when necessary. The difference is that its decision does not come from confusion. It comes from understanding. Real calm does not weaken action. It makes action more precise. Instead of wasting energy on reactivity, a person concentrates it. Instead of exposing themselves through anxiety, they position themselves with accuracy. Instead of fighting every battle, they choose the ones that truly matter. In the future, this ability will become even more decisive. The faster the world moves, the more anxiety will be used as a driver of behavior. And the more people are pushed toward impulsiveness, the greater the advantage will be for the one who knows how to keep the mind whole. Because calmness in a chaotic environment is not only a personal virtue, it is strategic power. It is what keeps you from being driven by fear, provoked by noise, or manipulated by urgency. Sun Tzu teaches that clarity is a form of strength. Anyone who is not ruled by anxiety and impulsiveness not only makes fewer mistakes, they also see farther. And seeing farther changes everything. Because many times, winning is not about attacking first, responding louder, or showing more intensity. Many times, winning means keeping the mind so clear that the right move becomes visible. Calmness, then, stops being just a form of peace and reveals itself for what it truly is, an advantage. Peace does not arrive when the world finally stops frustrating us, but when we learn not to hand our soul over to everything that happens. Each of these thinkers, in their own way, pointed in the same direction. There is a quiet strength in the person who no longer needs to control everything, react to everything, please everyone, or win every battle. Detachment, when properly understood, does not make life poorer. It gives back clarity, dignity, and freedom. If this video made sense to you, if any of these ideas spoke directly to the moment you are living right now, then I truly want to thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for watching, for giving your time, and for walking with me through these reflections. And now I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel so you can keep following content like this, because we still have many philosophical journeys to explore together. Also, like this video, because that really helps the channel reach more people who may need to hear this message right now. Share it with someone who feels overwhelmed, trapped by other people's opinions, or tired of trying to control everything. And of course, leave a comment. Which of these philosophers spoke to you the most today? Which of these lessons connects most with your life right now? And do not leave the channel just yet. Stay here and keep watching the next videos, because the next reflection may be exactly the idea that changes the way you see yourself and the world. See you in the next video.